Imagine waking up one morning and your entire world, your language, your money, your government, your gods, has been replaced overnight. Not by a natural disaster, not by an earthquake, by people, by a group of human beings who looked at the world and said, "This should belong to us." That is the story of civilization. That is the story of empires. And here's the wild thing. It has happened over and over again across 6,000 years of recorded history. Empires rise, they dominate, they collapse, and from the rubble, something new always crawls forward. Today we're going to do something ambitious. We're going to travel from the very first cities on Earth, all the way to the last great empires of the modern age. And we're going to ask the most important question in all of history. Why do civilizations rise? And why do they always fall? Buckle up. This is the entire history of empires and civilization. Let's go back, way back. About 10,000 years ago, human beings were nomads. We followed herds of animals, picked berries, survived. Nobody owned anything. Nobody ruled anybody. And in a lot of ways, life was rough, but it was equal. Then something extraordinary happened. Agriculture. Someone, and honestly, it was probably a woman, since women were typically the gatherers who understood plant life. Someone figured out that if you put a seed in the ground and waited, food would grow right there. You didn't have to follow the buffalo anymore. The food came to you. And that single idea, farming, changed everything. Once people settled in one place, they needed to organize. Who gets what portion of the harvest? Who decides? And so the first leaders emerged. Priests, chiefs, kings. The world's first true civilization appeared in Mesopotamia, a name that literally means land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, in what is now modern-day Iraq. Around 3500 BCE, the Sumerians built the city of Uruk, quite possibly the first real city in human history, with a population that may have reached 50,000 people. Think about that. 50,000 people, living together, at a time when most of humanity was still hunting. The Sumerians invented writing, called cuneiform, not for poetry or philosophy, but for accounting, tracking grain, tracking livestock. The first written records in human history were basically spreadsheets, and from this one fertile crescent of land, the idea spread like wildfire. Egypt rose along the Nile. The Indus Valley civilization bloomed in what is now Pakistan and India. China's first dynasties emerged along the Yellow River. Each independently, humans were arriving at the same conclusion: we are stronger together. And whoever controls the center of together, controls everything. Now here's where things get interesting. Because once you have cities, you have something worth taking. The world's first empires weren't built on diplomacy. They were built on force. The Akkadian Empire, led by a man named Sargon of Akkad around 230–34 BCE, is often considered the world's first empire. Sargon didn't just conquer his neighbors. He unified them under one administration, one currency, one language. He was, in a very real sense, the world's first emperor. But it was Egypt that gave us the most iconic image of early civilization. The pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods. Or at least, that's what they wanted you to believe. The pyramids weren't just tombs, they were propaganda. Monuments that said, louder than any army, "Look what we can do. Do not even think about crossing us." At its height, ancient Egypt controlled trade routes across the ancient world for over 3,000 years. 3,000 years. The United States has existed for roughly 250. Rome lasted about 500 in the West. Egypt was doing it for 3,000. But Egypt wasn't alone. The Assyrian Empire to the north was arguably the most terrifying military force of the ancient world. They pioneered psychological warfare. They would deliberately publicize their brutality so that enemies would surrender without fighting. It sounds monstrous, and it was. But it also worked. Then came Persia. Under Cyrus the Great, the Achaemenid Persian Empire became the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Egypt to the borders of India. And here's what makes Cyrus genuinely remarkable. Unlike many conquerors, he respected the cultures he conquered. He let peoples keep their religions, their customs, their languages. He even freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity, an act so meaningful it's recorded in the Bible. Cyrus understood something that most conquerors didn't. It's easier to rule people who don't hate you. But even Persia would eventually meet its match. In 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king crossed into Persian territory with an army and a burning obsession to conquer the known world. His name was Alexander the Great, and in just 13 years, Before dying at age 32, he built an empire stretching from Greece to Egypt to the borders of India, spreading Greek language, philosophy, and culture everywhere he went. Historians call this period the Hellenistic Age, and it fundamentally fused East and West in ways that still echo today. But Alexander's empire didn't last. The moment he died, his generals carved it up like a pie. Enter Rome. Rome is arguably the most influential civilization in Western history. And the fascinating thing about Rome is, it didn't start as an empire. It started as a republic. The Romans hated kings. After overthrowing their last monarch in 509 BCE, they invented a system of shared governance. 2 consuls, a senate, checks and balances. Sound familiar? The American founding fathers practically copied it. For centuries, Rome expanded through military genius and political savvy. Their legions were the most disciplined fighting force in the ancient world. Their roads, tens of thousands of miles of them, connected an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. But Rome also gives us one of history's great cautionary tales. Because the republic broke, inequality grew. Generals became more powerful than senators. And in 27 BCE, a man named Augustus Caesar became Rome's first emperor, the republic quietly becoming the empire it had always feared. At its peak, roughly 70 million people, about 20% of the world's entire population, lived under Roman rule. Rome gave us concrete, aqueducts, the calendar you use today, the languages that became French, Spanish, Italian and Portuguese, Christianity as a state religion, and the very concept of codified law. The Han dynasty in China was running an empire just as vast, just as sophisticated, and arguably more technologically advanced than Rome, at the exact same time. They invented paper. They gave us the first seismograph. They built the first stretch of what would become the Great Wall. When Rome fell in 476 CE, it didn't just collapse, it transformed, and everything that came after in Europe was built in its shadow. Here's something Western history classes often get wrong. While Rome was rising and falling, the rest of the world wasn't sitting around waiting. Then came the Islamic Golden Age. After the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Islam spread with extraordinary speed. Within a century, the Islamic Caliphate stretched from Spain to Central Asia, and in cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, scholars were translating ancient Greek texts, inventing algebra, pioneering astronomy, and developing medicine that would be used in European universities for the next 600 years. While Europe stumbled through the so-called Dark Ages, the Islamic world was flourishing. And then came the force that shook everyone, the Mongols. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan united nomadic tribes on the steppes of Central Asia and unleashed the most devastating military campaign in human history. By the time the Mongol Empire reached its peak, it was the largest contiguous land empire ever. Stretching from Korea to Hungary, the Mongols killed tens of millions. Entire cities were wiped from the map. They devastated the Islamic Golden Age when they sacked Baghdad in 1258, reportedly killing the Caliph and throwing the great library's books into the Tigris River, turning it black with ink. And yet, the Mongols also created the largest free trade zone in history. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, allowed goods, ideas, and people to travel safely from China to Europe along the Silk Road. The Black Plague traveled that road too, but so did gunpowder, pasta, and the compass. History is rarely simple. By the 1400s, Europe had a problem. The Ottoman Empire, which had risen from the ashes of both Byzantine Rome and the Mongol devastation, now controlled the land routes to Asia. Spices, silk, gold, all blocked. So Europe went around. Portugal pioneered the sea routes around Africa. Spain funded a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus to sail west, and accidentally stumbled upon 2 continents that European maps didn't even know existed. What followed was one of the most consequential and devastating eras in human history, the age of European colonialism. In less than 200 years, Spain and Portugal carved up the Americas. Britain, France, and the Netherlands built global empires through trade and military force. Indigenous populations, numbering perhaps 50 to 100 million people in the Americas alone, were decimated by disease, warfare, and forced labor. The British Empire became the largest empire in history, at its peak, covering roughly 24% of the Earth's land surface and ruling over 400 million people. The sun, they said, never set on it, and in a geographic sense, that was literally true. But colonial empires carried within them the seeds of their own collapse. They spread ideas, liberty, rights, self-determination, and then were shocked when their colonies demanded exactly those things. The 20th century was, in many ways, the story of empires dying. World War I ended the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire, all in 4 brutal years. World War II ended the age of European colonial dominance, though the colonies themselves wouldn't gain independence without decades more of struggle. But empires didn't disappear, they evolved. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as 2 new kinds of empire. Not empires of territory, but empires of ideology. One exporting capitalism and democracy, one exporting communism. Their Cold War proxy conflicts shaped the entire second half of the 20th century, from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many declared it the end of history, the final victory of one model of civilization over another. But history, as we've seen, doesn't end. It just changes shape. Today, new powers are rising. China is pursuing what many historians call the largest infrastructure and influence project in history, the Belt and Road Initiative, echoing, almost deliberately, the ancient Silk Road. The United States grapples with its own imperial reach, and dozens of nations that were once ruled are now finding their voices. So, 6,000 years, dozens of empires, millions of stories. What does it all mean? Here's what I take away from all of this. Every single empire in history, without exception, believed it was the final empire, the one that would last forever. Rome called itself the Eternal City. The British spoke of their empire as a civilizing mission with no end date. Every superpower has, at some point, looked at the map and thought, we have arrived. This is how it stays. And every single time, history has said, no, it doesn't. That's not a pessimistic conclusion, it's a humbling one. Because the other pattern, the one that gives me genuine hope, is this. Something always survives. The ideas, the art, the philosophy, the architecture, the language, the food. Long after the armies go home and the emperors are dust, something of what they built keeps living. The Sumerians are gone, but writing, their invention, carries this very script to you right now. Rome collapsed, but its legal code underpins every Western democracy. The Islamic Golden Age was shattered, but algebra, astronomy, and medicine, they survived. Civilizations don't just die, they transform. And the most honest thing history teaches us is this. The people who shape the next chapter of civilization are rarely the ones who look back at the old one with nostalgia. They're the ones who look forward. So, what comes next? That part of the story? It's yours to write. If you made it to the end of this video, you just traveled 6,000 years of human history. Drop a comment telling me which empire you think was the most fascinating. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.